Welcome to Spotlight Sessions, where we shine
What's
a light
your
on
story?
incredible. What does accessibility mean to you?
What's your mission? Wakschlag, a senior director. Welcome all to accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a light on incredible individuals and organizations and the work that they do. I'm your host, Josh Basil. I'm a C4-5 quadriplegic, paralyzed below my shoulders, and a power wheelchair user. I'm the Community Relations Manager at accessiBe and a passionate disability rights advocate and trial attorney focused on breaking down barriers to access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Today on accessiBe Spotlight Sessions, we're joined by Shira Wakschlag, the Senior Director of Legal Advocacy and General Counsel at the ARC. Welcome, Shira.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have you on the program today. And can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got connected with the ARC?
Sure. So I direct the ARC's litigation work, and I started out my legal career with a Skadden Fellowship at Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, and have always really been in the disability rights legal world since graduating from law school. My connection to the work is through partly through my siblings, who I have two adult siblings. I'm in the middle, and they both have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I'm also the parent of a younger daughter who has intellectual and developmental disabilities and is non-speaking. So it's really a passion for me to do this work, and through my life experience and family. And it was really important to me after starting out my career at Dredif, which was a great launching pad to really start out in Berkeley, California, kind of where a lot of the disability rights movement began. It was really important to me to continue in a community-based organization and a nonprofit. And so that's kind of how I ended up at the ARC. And it's just been a really exciting place to be. The ARC is a national organization. We have around 600 chapters nationwide. And so a lot of those organizations are doing direct services for people with IDD across the country. Our state chapters are doing state policy work. And our national office does federal policy programs, litigation. And so what I oversee is the development of disability rights litigation on behalf of people with disabilities. Specifically, our focus is IDD, and often on representing our chapters.
Well, the ARC is an incredible organization, and it's been around, and it's just from a power and numbers standpoint, it's a force to be reckoned with.
We're almost at our 75th anniversary, so stay tuned for more on that.
That's so cool. And it's just, there's so many ways to impact change. And I know you were talking about, being from the Berkeley area and how the disability rights movement, but advocacy can be done on the ground. It can be done through the legislature. It can be done through the courts. I love that you are doing a really special way of influencing change through the courts. But tell me more about kind of what you love most about what you do and kind of the work that you do.
Yeah. So I think, doing disability rights work, it's such a wide variety. You're never going to be bored because it's really about what impacts the lifespan of a person with a disability. That's what we cover at the ARC. So it's incredibly broad. And there's so much variety in terms of what types of issues we're tackling. And because even though I have this sign behind me, which is outdated, but the law is not, it's now over 30 years old. But that's still, newer than a lot of, than some other civil rights and other laws, which have more precedent behind them. And so a lot of the work that we do under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other disability rights litigation is also often precedent setting, because it's still, a lot of these issues are often the first time a court is hearing about something, or whether, first time a court is applying the ADA to a new circumstance that didn't exist in 1990. And so there's just so many, interesting opportunities that come up in doing this work to really think about how can we make the courts understand the real life impact that various barriers have on people with disabilities, people with IDD, and making sure they really understand the needs of people with disabilities, and how barriers really do impact them and how you can use the law to address those barriers.
Well, there's so much that you have to teach. There's that history. There's so many disability groups. There's so many unique abilities, and having to teach that and letting, whether it's the courts or jurors or judges, fully understand this unique population and the needs and the barriers and what the laws are. I know it's just the ADA is, over 30 years old, but yet we're still we're still fighting the daily fights to like enforce it and to have those protections and those rights. And it's kind of, you wouldn't think that we would have to fight as hard 30 years from now, but or 30 years today, but it's a never ending and worthwhile, advocacy effort. And it's awesome that you get to do your job, and like it's just such a cool job to have. Like it really is. It's such
It is,
meaningful work.
endlessly interesting and requires a lot, I think, of creativity and trying to figure out how to get courts to understand the law, as robust as we believe it to be, as when it was enacted. It's a comprehensive law that's meant to really address discrimination in every aspect of life. But as you mentioned, we're not where we want to be, right, as a society. And we have this great law, and it's an extremely critical and important tool. But there's only so many of us, and there's only, and there's of course limitations in any type of advocacy. And so we're always just fighting hard to keep progressing and not go backwards, because of course we've seen periods of time where we felt like, are we going backwards? And really trying to make sure that the law is upheld, that the law continues to be strong, that we set good precedent, and of course that our policies and everything else and all the other aspects of the toolbox that we need to keep things moving forward as a society on this front are also simultaneously advancing. So it's always, I think, important to think about both. I mean, we've come a long way in certain ways, but also just have so much more that we need to do.
Well, just with the ARC, like there's a handful of organizations, true advocacy organizations, that if they're going to do it right, they need to have counsel, like a legal advocacy council, like within their walls to really, take it to the next level rather than the state and federal legislature. It's great. That's an important piece of the puzzle for advocacy. But I really do feel the courts in today's political world is sometimes the fastest and easiest way to create real change, both locally and across the country. Can you talk a little bit more about how the courts and legal action are that powerful tool for organizations to really make real change?
Yeah, so I think a lot of my co-counsel would find it amusing to call courts fast, but because we find them so slow moving a lot of the time. But it is true that sometimes filing a legal action can, for a lot of different reasons, cause a change in behavior right away, even if the action might actually take longer. And of course, there are emergency actions for emergency quicker relief than you could normally get. But and of course, every avenue of advocacy takes a very long time. I mean, so does policy, so does grassroots mobilization. So you just have to keep kind of fighting on all fronts. But yeah, I think that the courts are an incredibly important and powerful tool that disability rights advocates need to continue to use in the fight for equality. They're, at the ARC, we're an interdisciplinary organization, so we have programs, we have federal policy, we have grassroots advocacy, among other work, and all of those things need to work hand in hand, right? So if we're, at the forefront of making sure that federal policy is advancing the rights of people with disabilities, but then we're seeing that on the ground, this particular aspect of the law is not being implemented properly, or it's not being interpreted in a broad scope as it's meant to be, we need to then come in, on the court level in legal action to really make sure that the laws are properly interpreted on the ground, and that they're really having robust enforcement, and making sure that they have teeth as well, because it's just so important to make sure that these laws are actually being realized and they're actually protecting people's rights, and it's not just something that's on a more theoretical basis. And so we really need to all work in tandem to make sure that these rights are moving forward and are fully protected.
Yeah, there's so many pieces of the puzzle that where we can really change our future outlook and what it can be. And I do, as a trial attorney myself, I do love the courts, and I know with the courts that comes with lots of memorable moments and memories and stories. Is there any particular case or legal action with the ARC that has really had a lasting impact on you?
Yeah, I would just focus on one that's the most recent, which is our voting rights trial in Texas. In that case, it's Lupe v. Abbott. We were challenging a law, SB1, that came out of Texas. That's a voter suppression law. And we partnered with a number of different groups, including the Legal Defense Fund, and a number of other organizations who were fighting all different aspects of this law, including race discrimination. And the ARC came in to really focus on the disability rights claims, in addition to kind of making sure that the court understood that, discrimination is compounded for different groups that are across all different communities. So you might have Black voters with disabilities who are experiencing discrimination in multiple forms when they're trying to vote. And so it's also, one piece of that, participating in that case that I think was really powerful was that so many of these different groups came together to try to educate the court about how this compounded discrimination can happen, and how different people that are a part of multiple impacted and often disenfranchised communities can experience multiple forms of discrimination in trying to access the vote. The trial itself was, there was just such powerful testimony from voters with disabilities and many other voters talking about how this law harmed them and how this law disenfranchised them. So I think, you can write something in a legal brief and maybe we as lawyers may think it's powerful, and I think it is powerful in many ways, but to hear it from the people who are impacted themselves and to really see it and understand that narrative on a much more human, individual level, I think is just so critical and so important for the court to see. And I think it was just such an educational experience for the court, but both in general, but also just for this particular lawsuit, I think it was really powerful that we had almost, I think about 10 witnesses. Some of them were voters with disabilities. Others were those who assisted voters with disabilities. Others were, executive directors of organizations such as the ARC of Texas and Rev Up Texas, that advance disability rights. And we also had a disability rights and voting expert, who himself is a person with a disability. And so I think it was just so important and powerful for the court to hear from all of these people directly, and really hear those stories that came alive outside of the legal briefings once we had trial.
It's just such meaningful work. I really thank you for what you do.
We're awaiting a decision, so we'll see what happens.
No, but you're fighting the good fight, and that's for sure. What's a misconception in regards to the intellectual and developmental disability, which is called the IDD community, that you would like to debunk?
So I think I'll focus on what I sometimes see in the courts, and something that we sometimes will focus on in an amicus brief, which is a lot of the times there's this kind of tendency, obviously not just in the courts, but in the courts, to maybe group everyone together or really just focus on challenges and barriers because we're talking about discrimination. And that can sometimes undermine the fact that every single person here, is an individual. Every single person with a disability has many strengths, just as any person in the world has both strengths and faces barriers and challenges in their lives. And so I think it's always a balance because, of course, in a discrimination case, which is usually the cases that we're bringing, you are often focusing on how it is difficult for this individual or this group, usually we're doing more systemic cases, this group of individuals with disabilities to access a certain service or program and all the barriers that society has put up for them that makes it hard for them to access these services. But it's critical that the humanity is not lost in that, and that and I think, as I was talking about with trial, it was just so critical that the judge be able to hear from voters with disabilities directly so that you really have a full picture. These are human beings with stories and with jobs and with full lives. And, it's so much more than just talking about the barriers. It's so important to really understand the full picture and the unique strengths of each person. So I think sometimes that can get, maybe just not focused on enough because you're talking about one specific aspect of things, which is focused on negative, the negative discrimination barriers. And that's, of course, the focus when you're bringing a lawsuit. But I think it's still critical that the court understand the full picture. And so that can be, that's often something that we're working on.
Well, the full picture, it's just so often you just don't know what you don't know, and you got to teach the world all that they don't know, and then become that much more informed.
And I think one example of that is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So in our voting rights case, one of the aspects of what we were challenging had to do with the law made it harder for voters with disabilities to receive the assistance they needed to vote. And as part of the testimony of a number of voters with disabilities, many of them spoke about the direct support professional crisis and how they felt that where, a law that was basically criminalizing the assistance they needed from their direct support professionals or DSPs, they talked about like such broader ramifications to that, right? That maybe this person wouldn't show up for the entire day because they were afraid to assist them with voting, and that would jeopardize their ability to get to work, their ability to do any of the things that they needed to do that day. And they also even went as far as talking about threats of institutionalization if they don't have the supports that they need. And I think that was just so important and powerful for the court to understand because we're talking about voting rights, so most people are not going to make this automatic connection between the direct support professional workforce crisis and threats of institutionalization and criminalizing voter assistance, right? But several of the voters with disabilities who testified made that clear connection. And so I think it was just really important to understand that fuller context, right? This is not only about how a person receives assistance in voting. And of course that's the focus of the case, but there's this broader picture and context that needs to be understood as part of that case, as part of that discussion.
That full picture, it's a big one. And one of my favorite questions to always ask guests are, what does accessibility mean to you?
So accessibility to me means an equal opportunity to participate in the world around you. And that means, as part of what's unique about a disability civil rights laws is that means that, people with disabilities require and must be granted reasonable accommodations when they need them to achieve that equal opportunity. So it's not a passive obligation, right, on behalf of that businesses and other government agencies can just say they've made something equal. This is an ongoing obligation. It's an affirmative obligation, and often it's individualized. And so to achieve that equal access, I think it's always important for people to keep in mind that the ADA requires proactive supports, and that's something that you don't necessarily see in other contexts. And I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind, that that's just an ongoing obligation.
Shira, thank you so much for being our guest today on accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions. Your insights, your stories, and all that you do. You're awesome. Just want to let you know that. And
You're awesome. Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to be part of this.
thank you. And for all of our guests, as always, thank you so much for staying to the end and for being on this journey with us. And until next time, take care. And Sheryl, you take care as well. And everyone have a beautiful day. Bye, Sheryl.
Thank you.